You're lying in a quiet room, wrapped in stillness, and the world feels soft around the edges. Somewhere far from here, beyond the hum of your thoughts and the weight of your eyelids, there's another world waiting to unfold. A world of clay tablets and soft sandals, of bustling bazaars and sun-baked courtyards, of scribes hunched patiently over damp rectangles of mud. Welcome to ancient Babylon. The streets are warm beneath your feet. The sun a golden haze overhead. People move slowly here. Nothing hurries, not even time. A baker fans the air beside his clay oven. A child pulls a goat gently by a piece of twine. Somewhere nearby, a temple bell rings, deep and round, like a sigh. You wander deeper into the city. Around you, ziggurats stretch like layered mountains into the sky, their steps worn smooth from centuries of climbing. Palms wave sleepily in courtyards. The scent of dates and spices floats on the air, mingling with dust, sandalwood, and the ever-present perfume of clay. This is a city that breathes through writing. Not paper, not ink, but tablets, slabs of soft earth pressed with careful wedge-shaped marks. On every corner, scribes bend over them, their hands practiced and calm. In shops, homes, temples, and palaces, stories are carved, not to be shouted or displayed, but quietly recorded and tucked away. Tonight, we're going to read one of those stories. Not a myth or a battle, not a king's decree, but something smaller, quieter, a complaint. Because it turns out, ancient Babylon had customer service issues, and people, being people, were not shy about expressing their mild but deeply felt dissatisfaction. Not with a tweet, not with a phone call, but with a stylus and some clay. So as you settle in, let your mind drift, backward through centuries, beyond stone and sand, to a time when even bad copper and missing donkeys found their way into history. This is the sleepy saga of Babylon's scribes, the complaints they captured, and the curiously calm chaos of a world written in mud. The scribes of Babylon were the quiet heroes of ancient administration, stoic, ink-stained, clay-dusted, multitaskers hunched over damp tablets in courtyards, alleyways, and temple archives. While kings issued laws and merchants sailed the Euphrates, it was the scribes who transformed the chaos of city life into symbols, rows, and blocks. Tiny, wedge-shaped impressions arranged in horizontal symmetry like whispers frozen in time. Scribes weren't mere transcribers. They were the ancient world's notaries, accountants, secretaries, editors, and postal workers rolled into one. In a city where laws were written in stone and business ran on clay, scribes stood at the dusty heart of bureaucracy. You might imagine them sitting in cool, shaded chambers, stylus in hand, but the reality was often more hectic. Picture a young apprentice perched cross-legged on the edge of a low wall, tablet balanced carefully in his lap, squinting to copy a message dictated by a sweating trader who just lost a shipment of barley and is very unhappy about it. To be a scribe in Babylon, you had to graduate from the Eduba, the tablet house, or scribal school. There, boys from literate or elite families were trained to press a stylus into clay with methodical precision. No ink, no paper, just a damp square of mud and a sharpened reed. They memorized hundreds of signs, not letters, but logograms, symbols that stood for entire words or ideas. One stylus stroke too deep, and boom, your ox might become God or beer. Though, to be fair, beer gods were a thing. The Eduba wasn't for the faint of heart. Students copied long proverbs, legal codes, and epic poetry onto tablets until their fingers cramped and their knees went numb. Teachers prowled like hawks. Mistakes meant more than a slap on the wrist. Sometimes you got a poem about your own incompetence immortalized in clay. Still, for those who made it, a scribal career offered upward mobility and surprising perks. Scribes could work for temples, palaces, wealthy merchants, or freelance if they had enough contacts. Some even wrote their own names at the bottom of tablets, a quiet flex in a world where anonymity was the norm. A scribe with a flair for composition might be hired to write oaths, prayers, curses, or even the official correspondences between kings. And, oh, the volume of writing. Babylon was a city of records, transactions, inventories, contracts, property disputes, dowries, tax reports, grain ledgers, astronomical observations, and endless legal squabbles. Each record required at least one clay tablet, sometimes more, and it all had to be stored, cataloged, and retrievable. Which brings us to the filing system. If you're imagining rows of tidy shelves, think again. Archives were chaotic stacks of tablets, occasionally organized by date, topic, or sheer hope. A merchant's archive might be a basket by the door. A palace archive could span an entire room, where scribes padded barefoot across rows of baked and unbaked tablets, trying to locate that one receipt for temple sheep from 9 summers ago. Scribes were the silent witnesses to every squabble and ceremony. They wrote down accusations of theft, promises of marriage, declarations of war, and, yes, petty complaints about poor service, bad copper, or missing donkeys. They were the stenographers of the ancient world, capturing every hiccup in the grand experiment of civilization. But it wasn't all work. Some scribes slipped jokes into their texts. A few copied love poems. Others drafted riddles or poetic insults, likely shared during the scribal version of coffee breaks. Babylonian humor was dry, occasionally indecipherable, and often obsessed with donkeys. Why? No one knows. Despite the tediousness of their tasks, scribes held enormous power, especially those stationed in temples or working closely with the king's court. The phrase "written in clay" carried a sacred weight. To carve words was to preserve them, and preservation meant permanence. Even now, thousands of years later, we are still reading the minds of scribes who pressed their grievances, or someone else's, into tablets and forgot them under the sands of time. Imagine one such scribe, seated cross-legged near the Ishtar gate as the sun sets. The market winds down. Traders pack up. Pigeons strut along the walls. He smooths the surface of a fresh clay tablet with a wet palm, dips his stylus, and begins to write, "Tell Ea Nasir this. The copper you sent is subpar. My messenger was treated with contempt. This will not stand." Another day. Another complaint. Another little square of immortal mud. Cuneiform. The name alone sounds a bit like something you'd find buried in an academic textbook, and indeed, that's where most of us encounter it. But in its time, this writing system was anything but obscure. It was the lifeblood of communication across Mesopotamia, used by scribes, kings, merchants, priests, and everyday citizens to give structure to the spoken word and permanence to memory. Welcome to Cuneiform 101, where the letters are wedges, the paper is mud, and spellcheck is entirely manual. First things first, why wedges? The term cuneiform comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, a name given by modern scholars who noted the distinct triangular impressions in the clay. The original writers of cuneiform didn't call it that. They were too busy poking damp clay with sharpened reeds, styluses, to care about what future historians might name it. Imagine holding a small rectangle of clay in your palm. It's about the size of an index card, damp and cool. In your other hand, a stylus, flat on one edge, pointed on the other. You don't draw lines the way we do with pens. Instead, you press the edges and corners into the clay, leaving little marks that resemble bird tracks. There are no curves, no flourishes, just clean, sharp angles and methodical precision. Each symbol is a combination of these wedge marks. Some signs stand for objects: a star, a mountain, a foot. Others represent syllables or whole words. The script evolved over centuries, becoming increasingly abstract and versatile. In the earliest tablets from Sumer, around 3200 BCE, the writing was pictographic, like tiny doodles. But by the time of Babylon's height, Cuneiform had transformed into a sleek, rule-bound system of over 600 signs. It wasn't phonetic like our alphabet. Rather, cuneiform was logophonetic, part logograms, word signs, and part syllabograms, sound signs. It could spell out sounds and represent whole concepts at once, which made it flexible, and very, very confusing for beginners. Learning to write it took years. Scribes had to memorize hundreds of signs, not just what each one looked like, but how it changed depending on context, orientation, or the quirks of the scribe who wrote it. A single wedge pressed at the wrong angle could transform grain into curse, or offering into exile. High stakes for what was essentially mud doodling. There were no spaces between words, no punctuation, and verbs often went at the end of the sentence, so by the time you knew what someone had done, you'd already read who they did it to, when, where, and why. Still, it worked. Cuneiform was used for over 3,000 years across multiple languages: Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, Babylonian, and even Hittite. It was the go-to script for international diplomacy, legal codes, medical texts, and lullabies. Let's say you're a Babylonian merchant and you want to send a polite but stern letter to a supplier. You commission a scribe. He asks, "Shall we use the formal Akkadian structure? Do you wish to invoke Marduk or skip the pleasantries?" He wets the clay, sharpens his stylus, and begins. Each sign is carved in order, the damp tablet rotating slightly in his hands like a lazy Susan of bureaucracy. Finished, he adds a seal, your personal cylinder seal, rolled across the surface like a signature. The tablet is baked or dried in the sun, durable, tamper-proof, and ready for delivery. It might be wrapped in a clay envelope, yes, an envelope made of clay, inscribed with a copy of the message on the outside. That way, if the envelope was tampered with, your messenger would know. Cuneiform could be grand or mundane. One tablet might contain a hymn to Ishtar, goddess of war and love. Another might list 5 goats and a jug of beer owed to your cousin. The same script, the same wedges, but infinitely adaptable. And yes, sometimes cuneiform was used for humor. One tablet features a student writing, "The teacher said I was lazy and unskilled, but I say the teacher is rude." Another preserves an insult competition with lines like, "Your mother is so poor, she eats salt for dessert." Burned into clay for all eternity, even dreams were recorded in cuneiform. If someone dreamed of a snake in their bed or a falling star, they might consult a dream interpreter, who would refer to a tablet with known meanings. Whole manuals of dream symbolism were pressed into clay. The ancient Babylonians did not let the subconscious go unexplored. Over time, the script grew increasingly complex, until eventually, around 100 CE, it fell out of use. Clay tablets gave way to papyrus, parchment, and paper, but thousands of those tiny, wedge-filled slabs survived, buried in the sands of Iraq and Syria, unearthed by archaeologists, decoded by modern scholars, held in museum drawers where they still whisper dusty tales of missed deliveries, divine omens, and unpaid debts. To read cuneiform is to read echoes, and to write it, so slowly, so carefully, is to etch time itself. If you lived in ancient Babylon and needed to send a message, you wouldn't reach for parchment or quill, and you definitely wouldn't fire off an email or text. No, you'd need clay, preferably fresh and damp, and the services of a scribe with a decent stylus and even better patience. Then you'd ask, how is this going to get where it's supposed to go? Welcome to the wonderfully low-tech, dust-covered world of Babylonian communication, where the postal system was powered by human legs, animal hooves, and a whole lot of hopeful logistics. At first glance, Babylon may seem like the kind of place where messages got lost behind a donkey or dissolved in a sandstorm. But in reality, it had one of the most reliable early systems of information transfer in the ancient world. Not fast, not private, but surprisingly efficient. Let's start with the basics. Once your tablet was written and dried, either in the sun or lightly baked for durability, it would be entrusted to a messenger. These messengers weren't necessarily government employees. They might be servants, traders, hired runners, or temple assistants, depending on your status and budget. If you were important, or just had a lot of goats riding on the deal, you might send 2 messengers, or a well-armed one, especially if the tablet had to travel beyond city limits. Bandits weren't interested in your grammar, but they were always interested in your donkeys. Now, picture the messenger. He tucks your clay message into a leather pouch. If it's extra sensitive, he wraps it in another layer of clay. Yes, a clay envelope, and presses your personal seal on the outer shell. That way, the recipient knows if it's been tampered with. Privacy, Mesopotamian style. He then heads out, on foot or by animal, using the roads that crisscross the empire. Routes worn smooth by centuries of sandals and carts. Some were dusty tracks between villages, others were grand avenues maintained by kings, like the Royal Road, which later connected distant parts of Mesopotamia and Persia. These roads even had way stations for rest, water, and fresh mounts. Babylon didn't have mailboxes, but it had infrastructure. Messages could take days, weeks, or even months to arrive. But arrive they often did. And what happened at the other end? The recipient would break the clay envelope, sometimes literally cracking it open with a small hammer, and read the inner message. If it was in Akkadian, good. If it was in Sumerian or some obscure dialect, well, time to call in another scribe. Sometimes letters were passed from hand to hand, village to village. In rural areas, there might not be a formal messenger system at all. You'd simply wait until someone from your town was heading in the right direction and beg them to deliver your complaint about moldy grain or an absent fiancé. But in cities like Babylon, things were more organized. Temples had scribal offices where you could pay to have a tablet inscribed and dispatched. Palaces had official messengers, sometimes traveling in caravans, sometimes carrying dozens of tablets at once, labeled by topic or importance. Scribes even developed shorthand indicators to prioritize the clay mail, marks or notes in the corner to indicate urgent, official, or tell Ea Nasir this is the 3rd time I'm writing. Still, delays were common. A tablet might arrive with a note. Messenger was bitten by dog. Apologies for lateness, or it might arrive broken, smudged, or unreadable from rain, a reminder that fired clay is tough, but not invincible. There were even scribal records of disputes about message delivery. I sent you a warning last moon, one tablet complains, but you claimed you never received it. If your messenger failed, that is not my fault. Babylonian ghosting, in full force. And, just like today, there were scams. One famous case involves a man accused of forging a tablet, replicating someone's handwriting and seal to deliver a fake message. Clay forgery wasn't easy, but it happened often enough that some cities developed clay notaries, who could authenticate a tablet's origin. Perhaps the most surprising thing about all this? The emotional tone of many messages. They weren't cold or bureaucratic. They were personal, sometimes petty, often poetic. One man wrote to his trading partner, "You said you would send copper, and you did not. You have treated me with contempt. I have written you. I have sent messengers. Why do you remain silent?" Another simply wrote, "You promised wine. There is no wine. I am ashamed before my servants." Even kings got testy. The famous Amarna letters, sent centuries later between Babylonian and Egyptian rulers, are full of royal side-eye. You send me 2 gold goblets, but they are not gold. They are bronze. Are we children that we play with false gifts? But no matter how snarky the message, the process was slow, methodical, and deeply reliant on trust. No tracking numbers, no return receipts, just clay, time, and the thin thread of human honesty. So next time you send a message and it doesn't get a reply, think of ancient Babylon. Somewhere out there, a clay tablet might still be making its way through the dust, unopened, unread, but still politely demanding better copper. It begins with a name: A. Nasir. If there were a hall of fame for ancient customer service disasters, his name would be chiseled in marble at the front entrance. A. Nasir was a copper merchant living in the city of Ur, one of Babylon's neighbors, around 1750 BCE. He probably considered himself a respectable businessman. He likely wore clean linen, owned a tidy little home, and kept a ledger full of sales. But to one dissatisfied customer named Nanny, he was the last straw. Let's set the scene. Imagine Nanny, a merchant in his own right, dealing with the heat, the bureaucracy, and the delicate logistics of moving copper, an essential commodity for tools, weapons, and prestige items. He trusts Ea Nasir to deliver good quality ingots. But when the shipment arrives, it's disappointing. Not just disappointing, insultingly bad. The copper is subpar, the delivery is late, and worst of all, Nanny's messenger, who went to collect the goods, was treated with disrespect. Possibly shouted at, maybe even turned away at the door. Nanny had had enough. He sat down with his scribe, pressed clay into a neat rectangular tablet, and composed what is now considered the world's oldest known written customer complaint. Yes, really. Here's a translated excerpt of what he said, paraphrased just a bit for bedtime. Tell Ea Nasir, you have not treated me well. I paid you good money. You gave me bad copper. My messenger was humiliated. I will not accept this. I am angry. He's furious, yes, but also formal. There's no screaming, no swearing, no threats of negative Yelp reviews, just a firm tone of disappointment that somehow still feels timeless. You can almost hear the sigh at the end. The entire tablet fits in your hand. Pressed by a stylus into the clay are Nanny's grievances, his frustration immortalized not in shouting, but in neat little wedges. There's no punctuation, of course, no exclamation marks, but the message is clear. This copper is trash, and you know it. This one complaint, so well preserved, has become a legend among historians and museum curators. It now rests in the British Museum, cracked slightly at the corners but still deeply readable. Every time someone new discovers it, the same realization unfolds. Even 4,000 years ago, people got fed up with poor service. And Ea Nasir? This wasn't his first offense. Archaeologists have uncovered multiple tablets addressed to or referencing him, several with similar complaints. It seems he had something of a reputation for late deliveries and questionable quality. Perhaps he cut corners. Perhaps his copper came from unreliable sources. Or perhaps he was simply overwhelmed by demand and let his standards slide. Still, it's comforting to know that even in the Bronze Age people wanted accountability. They wanted respect. And they wanted copper that didn't crumble like stale bread. Nanny's complaint is special not because it's dramatic, but because it's mundane. It's the kind of message that could have been written yesterday, sent via email with a subject line like "disappointed in recent order." That ordinary tone, frozen in clay, reminds us that civilization has always rested on the small, transactional trust between people. When that trust breaks, we don't always yell. Sometimes we write it down. We press our complaint into something solid and hope someone reads it. Did Ea Nasir ever reply? Did he send a better shipment? Did Nanny get a refund? We don't know. The tablet ends without resolution, its edges quiet. No, dear Nanny, I apologize. No offer of store credit, just silence. But the message survived. Long after the copper rusted, after the warehouse crumbled, after the scribes and temples and markets all turned to dust, the complaint lived on. It sits now in a glass case. Museum-goers walk by, reading the placard. Some chuckle, some squint at the tiny marks. Some wonder what happened next. And Nanny, though long gone, is still speaking, still asking, "Is this really the best you can do?" Copper wasn't the only thing that triggered Babylonian tempers. In fact, once you begin to browse through the ancient archives, hundreds of clay tablets, each with their own firm, wedge-shaped lettering, you quickly realize that the complaints were as varied as they were oddly specific. These weren't high-stakes legal dramas or matters of life and death. They were the minor frustrations of daily life, the kind of things that people today might write in an angry Yelp review after a long day and a disappointing sandwich. So let's take a sleepy stroll through Babylon's Tablet Tantrum Hall of Fame. First up, a merchant named Arad Ea, who received a shipment of barley that had apparently been left out in the rain. This was no minor inconvenience. Wet barley spoiled quickly and smelled less than divine. His letter, pressed into clay with exasperated wedges, reads, "You told me it was dry. It is not dry. It is foul. Do not lie to me again." Strong words, but still very Babylonian. No capital letters, of course, just structured fury in uniform lines. Then there's the issue of beer. Babylonian society ran on it, not just as a beverage, but as currency, as rations for workers, even as offerings to the gods. So when a tavern served what one tablet calls thin, cloudy beer, it sparked more than just disappointed customers. A complaint was filed directly to the temple authorities, who oversaw certain vendors. "She sold cloudy beer. My men became ill. This is an offense to the goddess." One imagines a group of workers sulking outside a tavern, clutching their stomachs, muttering curses under their breath while someone marches off to report the indignity. Another classic example, a man named Bel-Etir, writing to his business partner who had failed to include a promised goat in a livestock trade. "Where is the goat? You swore by Marduk. You said, 'The goat is strong.' I see no goat." It's a beautiful little moment, disappointment wrapped in passive aggression. And again, the oath by Marduk adds that special touch of Mesopotamian formality. Then there are the late shipments. Ancient Babylonians, like us, hated waiting, and they especially hated waiting without updates. "You said the wool would arrive last moon. It did not. The sheep are already shorn again. What am I to do with twice-sheared fleece?" Even clay tablets couldn't hide the quiet scream behind that final sentence. But not all the complaints were from merchants. Some came from temple workers or even palace officials. One complaint from a temple cook, yes, a cook, describes how a delivery of lentils included stones, actual pebbles mixed in with the legumes. "These lentils are not clean. They damage teeth. This must not happen again." It's tempting to picture a royal priest biting down mid-ritual and discovering an unexpected crunch. And then there's the man who complained about a scribal student's handwriting. This was clearly written by a senior scribe, probably with one eyebrow permanently raised. This hand is unreadable. The boy copies poorly. He omits words. He adds nonsense. It ends with a dry warning. Let him return to the tablet house. If he stays here, mistakes will multiply. Ouch! Even servants had their complaints. One tablet, written on behalf of a house steward, describes a situation where the cook used too much sesame oil, a costly mistake. "You were told to use 1 jug. You used 3. The dish was drowned. The expense is noted." There's something comically modern about that, the kind of thing you might overhear in a restaurant kitchen today. "You drowned the dish again, Sargon." Of course, not every tantrum made it onto clay. Most daily grumbles evaporated with the heat, muttered over stews or muttered at donkeys. But those that were formalized, pressed, dried, and sealed were taken seriously. The act of writing a complaint was part of the performance. It gave weight to your grievance. It said, "I will not shout, I will document." And the complaints were usually short, not flowery, not angry in the way we often think of rage, more like stern little nudges. "You know, this isn't acceptable." Etched in mud, then delivered by hand across the dust. It's hard not to admire the civility behind it all. No all-caps rants, no personal insults, just structured disappointment and mild threats of divine shame. So next time you get the wrong item in a delivery, or your neighbor's music is too loud, consider the Babylonian method. Press your concerns into something lasting. Bake it, if you must, and trust that 4,000 years from now someone might read your grumble and say, "Ah, this person was having a day." By now, you've probably gathered that merchants and barley sellers weren't the only ones filing complaints in ancient Mesopotamia. A fair share of ancient grumbling came from the everyday world of lost goods, late deliveries, and logistical fumbles, and when things went missing, the blame almost always began with the messenger. Imagine this. You're a modest trader. You've got a load of goods, perhaps some wool, dates, or the always suspect copper, to be picked up in one city and delivered to another. You send your trusted servant with a carefully inscribed tablet and strict instructions. Days pass, then weeks. Finally, your servant returns, empty-handed. What happened? That's what everyone in the archive wants to know. Because sometimes it wasn't just the goods that disappeared. Sometimes so did the donkey. Multiple tablets describe the same core scenario. A merchant sends someone with a shipment, and the person returns with an excuse, and not much else. One tablet reads, with the dry precision only a scribe could muster, "The barley was not delivered." The animal was said to be lame. The man claimed sickness. The barley is lost. You can almost hear the sigh in the spaces between the lines. Another more impatient scribe wrote on behalf of a client, "You sent word the donkey was attacked." But the seal was broken and no goods arrived. Was there a donkey at all? This is classic Babylonian passive aggression. I don't believe you, but I'll write it politely. There are also numerous instances of delivery delays with no explanation. One letter grumbles that the messenger claimed to have waited by the temple for 3 days for the seller to arrive. The response, "No one asked him to wait. The agreement was clear. The man is slow or dishonest." It's not difficult to imagine an exasperated merchant rereading this message while staring into a half-empty storeroom, muttering ancient equivalents of, "This is the last time I trust that guy." And the excuses. The tablets preserve a glorious archive of ancient delivery drama. The ferry overturned in the canal. A lion was seen near the road and caused delay. The porters argued and refused to carry the load. There was a festival. All work ceased. Now, to be fair, these things did happen. Travel was not safe or simple. Roads were dusty, sometimes non-existent. Weather could crack clay tablets mid-journey. And yes, lions really did roam parts of Mesopotamia. But sometimes you get the feeling that the messengers were simply not in a hurry. Which brings us to one of the most famous lines from a Babylonian complaint letter, addressed to a clearly unimpressed colleague, "Your man did not hurry. He sat and drank with the donkey." It's not entirely clear what this means. Maybe the man found a tavern and spent the night indulging while his donkey chewed barley nearby. But whatever the case, the tone is unmistakable. Disbelief, frustration, and maybe just a little admiration for the boldness of it. Of course, delivery errors didn't always stem from laziness. Sometimes the goods themselves went missing, and fingers were quick to point. One scribe filed this: 2 jars of wine were sent. One arrived. The seal was broken. Who opened it? There's no answer preserved, just the accusation. And then there's the dramatic but mysterious note sent from a temple clerk. The oxen were not returned. They were to be yoked by moonrise. What happened to them is unclear. It could have been theft, negligence, or a simple miscommunication. But whatever it was, it went into the record, etched in clay, sealed, and delivered to be pondered forever. Even in the most formal complaints, we find tiny glimpses of human behavior that feels so familiar. People making excuses, blaming co-workers, exaggerating events, hoping no one checks the details. There's even a case where two different tablets were discovered, both describing the same missing shipment, but from opposing sides. One from the sender, one from the supposed recipient, and, predictably, each blamed the other. One line reads, "I sent 5 baskets. You say you received 4. Perhaps one was lost, but not by me." The reply, "4 baskets were counted. No 5th was seen. I trust my porter. He is honest." And somewhere in the middle, presumably, a very full porter sipping date beer behind a warehouse. The truth may never have been discovered, but the story, like so many others in the Babylonian archive, was preserved. Each of these complaints, with their donkey disputes and delivery dramas, remind us that ancient commerce wasn't just about gold and grandeur. It was about logistics. It was about people. It was about things not arriving when they should have, and everyone pointing fingers until someone wrote it all down. And, thanks to clay, it stayed written. So if you're lying in bed tonight, waiting on a package that's now 3 days late, take a moment to picture Babylon. A dusty courtyard, a frustrated scribe, a tablet pressed with weary precision, and a donkey, somewhere out there, still not delivering what it was supposed to. Let's take a quiet step away from the shouts of traders and the suspicious donkeys, and instead peer into one of the more surprising corners of ancient Mesopotamian society, the tablet house, or, in Sumerian, Eduba. Picture a long, sunlit courtyard enclosed by clay brick walls. Inside, rows of benches made of stone. Young boys, mostly from elite families, sit hunched over damp rectangles of clay. The air smells faintly of earth and lamp oil. There is scratching, mumbling, the occasional sigh, and at the front, the master scribe, sharp-eyed and silent, holding a stylus like a conductor's baton. Welcome to school. Babylonian style. Learning to write cuneiform was no small task. It was a skill reserved for the upper tiers of society: future priests, administrators, merchants, and court officials. Literacy wasn't widespread, but for those who trained, it was a full-time endeavor. The first step? Learn how to hold the stylus. Flat end, angled just so, then practice making simple wedges in clay. Vertical, horizontal, diagonal. These little marks were the building blocks of over 600 signs. The student would copy the signs repeatedly on small tablets called exercise tablets. Most were broken and discarded after use, but many survived in trash heaps, giving archaeologists a clear window into ancient scribal education. Next came vocabulary drills. Lists of birds, trees, occupations, gods, fish, stones, months, diseases, constellations. These were copied and memorized, line after line, sometimes with teacher corrections in the margins. One particularly well-preserved tablet shows a student writing the Sumerian word for brick over and over again. You can imagine him at the end of a long afternoon, clay under his fingernails, wondering whether there was life beyond brick. The scribal schools weren't exactly warm and fuzzy. Discipline was strict. Another tablet, clearly written by a frustrated student, says, "The teacher struck me with a stick. I wept before my father. He did not listen. No erasers, no leniency. Make too many mistakes, and you'd simply start over, from the top, in fresh clay." But not everything was rote. Some lessons were playful. A famous series of scribal texts, known as the dialogues, featured imagined conversations between students and teachers, or between lazy and hardworking pupils. One goes like this: "Why did you not bring your tablet?" "It was broken." "Why was it broken?" "I dropped it." "Why did you drop it?" "I fell asleep." It's an ancient version of "my dog ate my homework," and even then, the teacher wasn't buying it. As students progressed, they moved on to copying proverbs and fables, short texts that offered both moral lessons and tricky grammar. One popular line reads, "The young man who does not listen will end up sweeping dung." Catchy and educational. Advanced students tackled legal texts, medical formulas, mathematical problems, and eventually literary works, hymns, myths, royal inscriptions. These were the final tests, the scribal equivalent of a graduate thesis. Some tablets even include colophons at the end, little notes like written by Enlil-bani, son of Lamasi, for the glory of Nisaba, goddess of writing. These are moments of quiet pride, proof that after years of shaping damp clay, a student had become a scribe. And scribes weren't just glorified record keepers. They were trusted members of society, guardians of knowledge, culture, and law. They were the ones who preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh, copied the king's decrees, calculated the phases of Venus, and, yes, recorded all those deliciously stern customer complaints. It's no wonder that writing was considered sacred. The goddess Nisaba, and later the god Nabu, were patrons of writing and learning. Scribes often made offerings before beginning important work. To write was to participate in something eternal. Even the act of storing tablets had ritual. Finished tablets were dried and catalogued in temple libraries or government archives. Some were wrapped in cloth. Others were shelved in wooden crates. Many had titles or keywords written on the edge, much like the spines of books. Occasionally, scribes would add a note in the corner, "Do not throw away," or, more helpfully, "For the palace record, keep dry." Many of these records weren't meant to be read by the general public. They were there to be preserved, like fossils of thought. And thanks to the durability of baked clay, thousands of them survived wars, fires, floods, and time itself. When modern archaeologists began unearthing these tablets in the 19th century, they were stunned. These weren't mere ledgers or royal boasts. They were fragments of ordinary life, etched with the soft press of human fingers and styluses made from reeds. They were student mistakes, shopping lists, love poems, insults, weather forecast. And quietly among them, nestled in the dust of centuries, were the clay notebooks of sleepy boys hunched over stone benches, trying their best to spell barley correctly for the third time in a row. Let's drift now to the heart of the city. Not the ziggurat, not the palace, but somewhere more humble, more human. The scribal workshop. You can almost hear it, the gentle scratching of styluses against clay, the occasional low murmur, the clink of pottery, the distant sound of street vendors calling out their wares. This is where scribes, both masters and apprentices, labored each day to record the rhythms of the world. Unlike the formal tablet house schools, scribal workshops were working spaces, part office, part archive, part clay-streaked studio. Some were attached to temples or palaces, others to merchant homes or marketplaces. If you stepped into one, you'd find everything a scribe needed to work: baskets of fresh clay, pots of water to keep the tablets moist, styluses of different sizes, and, of course, shelves lined with hardened tablets ready for reference. The head scribe sat near the entrance, often on a slightly raised platform or large cushion, taking dictation or reviewing the work of younger scribes. To his right and left, students copied texts, sometimes from live dictation, sometimes from model tablets. The workflow was oddly modern: incoming messages, outgoing replies, records for temple accounts, invoices for shipments, receipts, contracts, tax documents, name lists, legal oaths, even literary copies for posterity. Let's pause and imagine a typical job. A local merchant walks in, clay under his nails, with a message he wants sent to his brother in a nearby city. He nods politely and dictates, "To Kula, son of Emeshtu." The shipment has not arrived. Your delay dishonors our agreement. Respond quickly. The scribe listens, not judging. He flattens a lump of clay into a rectangle, moistens his stylus, and begins pressing wedges. Methodical, practiced, calm. The merchant watches in silence, soothed by the rhythm. When finished, the scribe reads the message aloud, signs it with his seal, and hands it back to be dried and sent. Sometimes the workshop had a small kiln to gently bake tablets that needed permanence. But often, sun-drying was enough. In rainy months, tablets were stored under awnings or hung from pegs in leather pouches. Very important ones might be enclosed in clay envelopes and sealed with carved cylinder seals rolled across the surface, like a tiny engraved rolling pin. Scribal workshops didn't just produce letters, they were the record keepers of civilization. They created birth certificates, property records, temple offerings, legal judgments, even recipes and medical instructions. One scribal archive uncovered in ancient Mari contained over 20,000 tablets, stacked carefully in rows. Many were unopened when found. The scribes had recorded everything, and thanks to their thoroughness and Clay's remarkable staying power, the voices of that city still speak today. The scribes themselves were a curious blend of bureaucrat and artist. Their handwriting, if you can call cuneiform that, was distinctive, even beautiful. Each had a style, and over time specialists today can identify individual scribes across hundreds of documents. Some scribes were known for elegant, flowing marks. Others were blunt and businesslike. Some carved deep and sharp, others light and shallow. A few added flourishes, careful spacing, decorative touches, or a little curl at the edge of the line. And yes, some made mistakes. We know this because scribes would occasionally leave little apologies on the tablets themselves. I wrote in haste. Forgive the crooked signs. This was copied from a broken original. Some words are lost. Written at night with a poor lamp. There is something so tender about these notes, proof that even in a rigid society, even with gods and kings watching, scribes were still people. Tired, pressured, sometimes unsure. Sometimes tablets contain marginal notes that feel oddly familiar. This text is boring. I dislike this customer. The copper smells bad. It's as if the scribe couldn't resist adding a whispered complaint of their own. And perhaps most striking of all is how anonymous yet deeply personal these records feel. You read a clay letter from 3,800 years ago, and it begins, "To my brother, may the gods keep you." There's no fanfare, just care, business, and clarity. In many ways, scribes were the memory of Babylon, its servers, its bookshelves, its inbox. They preserved deals, disputes, stories, and sorrow. They didn't write history for glory. They wrote it because someone asked them to, because something happened, and someone wanted it known. So, tonight, as your breath slows and your thoughts soften, imagine a quiet scribal room. Clay tablets stacked in the corners, the light of an oil lamp flickering against brick walls, a tired scribe dipping his stylus into water, adjusting his seat, and returning to work. Because even in sleep, the records must be kept. Now that we've seen where the tablets were written and who wrote them, let's explore where they ended up, and why some of them still exist today, thousands of years later. It's all thanks to the accidental brilliance of clay. Unlike paper or parchment, clay doesn't burn easily. It doesn't crumble in humidity. It doesn't rot. In fact, under the right circumstances, say, a city burned to the ground during a siege, it actually gets stronger. Yes, you read that right. While invading armies destroyed buildings, looted temples, and scattered communities, they often accidentally preserved history by setting fire to rooms full of clay tablets. The heat from the fires baked those tablets, permanently hardening them like ceramics in a kiln. That's how we've come to know so much about cities like Nineveh, Uruk, and Mari. Their palaces and libraries burned, but the tablets survived, sitting in ash and rubble for millennia until archaeologists uncovered them in the 19th and 20th centuries. So let's imagine the journey of a single tablet. It starts with a scribe, perhaps a sleepy apprentice in a scribal workshop, carefully writing out a letter, a receipt, or a hymn. The tablet is dried, maybe lightly baked, and stored on a shelf in a temple archive or a merchant's office. For weeks or years it sits there in silence, occasionally referenced, perhaps forgotten. Then disaster strikes. A neighboring kingdom attacks. Fires sweep through the buildings. The tablet, once soft and vulnerable, is suddenly exposed to intense heat. The clay, now hardened by flames, becomes virtually indestructible. Centuries pass. Dust settles. Walls collapse. The tablet remains buried, untouched, unread, until someone digs. That someone, in many cases, was a 19th century archaeologist. At first, they weren't always sure what they were finding. Early excavators thought the cuneiform tablets might be charms, weights, or strange bricks. But once translated, the floodgates opened. In one dig at Nineveh, over 30,000 tablets were uncovered in what we now call the Library of Ashurbanipal, a king who ruled Assyria in the 7th century BCE. His royal library included myths, omens, medical texts, tax lists, and even dream interpretation manuals. It was one of the first attempts in human history to collect and catalog all known knowledge. His collection included the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, rediscovered in fragments across multiple tablets. Without that fire and that archive, we might never have known the world's oldest epic poem. In other cities, similar finds occurred. In Mari, tablets were found stacked neatly in rooms, some with titles etched on the sides. In Ebla, thousands of tablets written in an early Semitic language revealed a rich legal and political culture. And in Ur, scribes buried tablets beneath foundations or sealed them in jars for future record-keeping. These were intentional acts of preservation, like time capsules. And yet they were never retrieved, either because the owners fled or because they never expected to return. Even personal letters have been found this way. One remarkable find included a series of tablets written between family members, discussing business, weather, and the well-being of goats. These were never meant for history books. But they survived, quietly nestled among ruins, waiting for someone with the patience to read wedge by wedge. Reading these tablets today isn't easy. Each one must be cleaned, cataloged, and deciphered. Many are broken or incomplete. Scholars sometimes spend years piecing together fragments like clay puzzles. Some tablets contain hundreds of lines of text, densely packed with abbreviations, spelling variations, and poetic phrasing. Yet, despite all this, the voices persist. You can still hear the complaint of a copper buyer, the worry of a father writing to his son, the pride of a scribe finishing a copy of an old myth. They speak in a language long dead, from cities long buried, but their tone feels almost modern. And isn't that the heart of it? That these tablets, born of bureaucracy and trade, somehow became mirrors of humanity. They weren't written with eternity in mind. They were meant for the next market, the next moon cycle, the next harvest. And yet they stayed. So as you drift off, imagine that final moment. A clay tablet, wrapped in cloth, slipped onto a shelf. A scribe gently stamps his seal in the corner. The room is quiet. The sun outside is low. He stands, stretches, and leaves the room. The tablet waits, and one day someone finds it, covered in dust, but still speaking. A tired scribe dipping his stylus into water, adjusting his seat, and returning to work. Because even in sleep, the records must be kept. Now that we've seen where the tablets were written and who wrote them, let's explore where they ended up, and why some of them still exist today, thousands of years later. It's all thanks to the accidental brilliance of clay. Unlike paper or parchment, clay doesn't burn easily. It doesn't crumble in humidity. It doesn't rot. In fact, under the right circumstances, say, a city burned to the ground during a siege, it actually gets stronger. Yes, you read that right. While invading armies destroyed buildings, looted temples, and scattered communities, they often accidentally preserved history by setting fire to rooms full of clay tablets. The heat from the fires baked those tablets, permanently hardening them like ceramics in a kiln. That's how we've come to know so much about cities like Nineveh, Uruk, and Mari. Their palaces and libraries burned, but the tablets survived, sitting in ash and rubble for millennia until archaeologists uncovered them in the 19th and 20th centuries. So let's imagine the journey of a single tablet. It starts with a scribe, perhaps a sleepy apprentice in a scribal workshop, carefully writing out a letter, a receipt, or a hymn. The tablet is dried, maybe lightly baked, and stored on a shelf in a temple archive or a merchant's office. For weeks or years it sits there in silence, occasionally referenced, perhaps forgotten. Then disaster strikes. A neighboring kingdom attacks. Fires sweep through the buildings. The tablet, once soft and vulnerable, is suddenly exposed to intense heat. The clay, now hardened by flames, becomes virtually indestructible. Centuries pass. Dust settles. Walls collapse. The tablet remains buried, untouched, unread, until someone digs. That someone, in many cases, was a 19th century archaeologist. At first, they weren't always sure what they were finding. Early excavators thought the cuneiform tablets might be charms, weights, or strange bricks. But once translated, the floodgates opened. In one dig at Nineveh, over 30,000 tablets were uncovered in what we now call the Library of Ashurbanipal, a king who ruled Assyria in the 7th century BCE. His royal library included myths, omens, medical texts, tax lists, and even dream interpretation manuals. It was one of the first attempts in human history to collect and catalog all known knowledge. His collection included the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, rediscovered in fragments across multiple tablets. Without that fire and that archive, we might never have known the world's oldest epic poem. In other cities, similar finds occurred. In Mari, tablets were found stacked neatly in rooms, some with titles etched on the sides. In Ebla, thousands of tablets written in an early Semitic language revealed a rich legal and political culture. And in Ur, scribes buried tablets beneath foundations or sealed them in jars for future record-keeping. These were intentional acts of preservation, like time capsules. And yet they were never retrieved, either because the owners fled or because they never expected to return. Even personal letters have been found this way. One remarkable find included a series of tablets written between family members, discussing business, weather, and the well-being of goats. These were never meant for history books. But they survived, quietly nestled among ruins, waiting for someone with the patience to read wedge by wedge. Reading these tablets today isn't easy. Each one must be cleaned, cataloged, and deciphered. Many are broken or incomplete. Scholars sometimes spend years piecing together fragments like clay puzzles. Some tablets contain hundreds of lines of text, densely packed with abbreviations, spelling variations, and poetic phrasing. Yet, despite all this, the voices persist. You can still hear the complaint of a copper buyer, the worry of a father writing to his son, the pride of a scribe finishing a copy of an old myth. They speak in a language long dead, from cities long buried, but their tone feels almost modern. And isn't that the heart of it? That these tablets, born of bureaucracy and trade, somehow became mirrors of humanity. They weren't written with eternity in mind. They were meant for the next market, the next moon cycle, the next harvest. And yet they stayed. So, as you drift off, imagine that final moment. A clay tablet, wrapped in cloth, slipped onto a shelf. A scribe gently stamps his seal in the corner. The room is quiet. The sun outside is low. He stands, stretches, and leaves the room. The tablet waits, and waits. And one day, someone finds it, covered in dust, but still speaking. While we've wandered the city streets, peeked inside tablet houses, and listened to the murmur of scribes, there's one more world to explore, one that touched nearly every corner of Babylonian life: the temples. To a Babylonian, temples weren't simply places of worship. They were the beating heart of the city, economic engines, educational centers, legal courts, food pantries, astronomical observatories, and yes, even real estate developers. Let's take a slow walk to the towering ziggurat, the temple complex at the city's center. It rises in steps above the rooftops, a man-made mountain of mud brick and mystery. At its peak, high above the dust and heat, sits the shrine to a god, Marduk, in the case of Babylon. His priests climb the long staircases daily, carrying offerings, burning incense, and tending sacred fires. But most of the temple's work happens at ground level, in the dozens of chambers and courtyards below. These rooms buzz quietly with activity. Scribes record incoming donations, barley, wool, copper, oil. Each offering is weighed, documented, and filed. Some go into storage, great vaulted rooms filled with grain jars, wool bundles, and temple livestock. Others are redistributed, to priests, to the poor, or to temple dependents. Temples were employers too. They ran farms, maintained flocks, managed laborers, and employed weavers to make garments for both sale and ritual. They even brewed their own beer. One clay tablet from the city of records the distribution of beer rations to workers on a temple construction project. Another outlines a dispute over the use of temple oxen for private farming, a reminder that even sacred cattle could become the subject of bureaucratic grumbling. Temples also held legal authority. Many disputes, especially those involving property, inheritance, or marriage, were settled within temple walls. A priest, assisted by scribes, would review testimonies, examine written contracts, and issue decisions that were binding and preserved on tablets. One particularly striking tablet from a temple archive records a case where two brothers argued over a piece of farmland. The land had been passed down, but the elder brother claimed exclusive rights. The priest listened patiently and, after checking earlier records, ruled in favor of a shared inheritance. The final lines read, "Let peace be between the sons of Enlil-Zeri. Let this be written for the gods." The gods, after all, were the final witnesses. Temples were also the keepers of time. Priests tracked lunar cycles, solstices, eclipses, and planetary motion. They maintained ritual calendars that dictated when to fast, when to feast, when to plow, and when to rest. This wasn't just astronomy. It was sacred accounting. Time, for Babylonians, was not a straight line but a series of divine appointments. One of the most respected roles in the temple was the diviner, a priest trained to read omens. This might mean studying the flight of birds, the shape of smoke, or, most famously, the livers of sacrificed animals. Yes, sheep liver was the ancient Babylonian crystal ball. Priests would inspect its shape, texture, and marks to interpret divine messages about upcoming battles, famines, or royal births. They even had clay models of livers for training, complete with labels. Imagine a classroom of apprentice diviners huddled around a model organ, whispering predictions and scribbling notes. But perhaps the most touching role the temple played was that of caregiver. Temples provided food to widows, orphans, and the sick. Some had attached healing centers, where priests would recite incantations, apply salves, and offer prayers. One tablet describes a ritual bath for someone suffering from a fever: warm water, specific herbs, a spoken chant to drive out the evil wind. In a time before modern medicine, this blend of practical care and spiritual comfort was a source of solace. The temple was also a school for young scribes, especially those destined for religious roles. They copied hymns, myths, and ritual instructions. Some tablets begin with lines like, "A hymn to Marduk," to be sung at the festival of washing the god. These texts had melody, rhythm, and structure. They were meant to be heard, not just read. Priests sang them during processions while swinging censers and pouring libations. And on festival days, the temple came alive. The streets filled with music, harps, flutes, drums. Statues of gods were bathed, dressed, and carried through the city in golden carts. People danced, feasted, lit fires. Children laughed as garlands were thrown from rooftops. The divine wasn't distant. It lived here, in brick and barley and song. But even in all this grandeur, the temple's foundation was the tablet. Without scribes, there was no memory, no record of offerings, no calendar of rites, no decision in a property dispute. So, deep in the temple, tucked into cool rooms behind thick doors, clay tablets were stacked, wrapped in linen, marked with seals, waiting. Some would never be touched again. Others would be carried to court, recited at ceremonies, or used to settle debates years later. Each was a voice. Each was an offering. So tonight, picture that inner sanctum. No tourists, no priests, just a scribe at a low bench, shaping wet clay into squares, whispering, "For the temple, for the record, for the gods." Now, let us drift away from temples and markets and follow the ancient roadways that led out of Babylon, into the realm of trade. Because Babylon wasn't just a city of scribes and priests, it was a bustling hub of merchants, caravans, and long-distance deals that stretched across deserts, mountains, and even oceans. Babylon sat in a fortunate position, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates, with access to overland routes to Anatolia, Iran, the Levant, and the Arabian Peninsula. The city wasn't an isolated island. It was a node in a vast web of trade connecting distant worlds. Imagine, early in the morning, a caravan preparing to depart. Camels are loaded with goods, heavy baskets balanced on either side, tied with thick rope. Merchants inspect their wares: polished copper, sacks of barley, woven textiles, jars of sesame oil, dried dates. Scribes hover nearby, styluses ready to document outgoing inventories. And then the caravan sets off. Hooves clopping, bells jingling softly, dust rising as they pass through Babylon's gates. Their destination? Perhaps Dilmun to the south, modern-day Bahrain, known for its pearls and incense, or Elam to the east with its stone and fine woods, or even far-off lands like the Indus Valley, where seals and beads hint at trade relations that reached across vast distances. Trade was not casual. It was structured, recorded, and legally protected. Clay tablets served as contracts, invoices, and even shipping manifests. One tablet might read, 30 measures of sesame oil, bound for Eshnunna, to be delivered by the merchant Ilushuma. In case of theft, he shall repay twice the value. Some tablets even listed the names of the donkeys involved in the journey. These weren't just beasts of burden. They were tracked, valued, and taxed. But not all trade was done over land. Babylon also had river ports. Boats carried goods up and down the Euphrates, stopping at cities large and small. These were broad, flat-bottomed vessels, easy to load and unload. Some were made from bundled reeds sealed with bitumen, others from wood when available. River transport had its own rhythm. One well-known letter from a frustrated merchant complains, "The boat did not come." I waited 4 days. The grain is spoiling. Merchants dealt not only with weather and theft, but with bureaucracy. Every shipment had to be weighed, taxed, and logged. Local governors issued passes or tolls. A clever merchant kept extra tablets, receipts, licenses, letters of introduction, just in case. But trade wasn't only about barley and bricks. It was also about ideas, art, language, and fashion. Babylonian cylinder seals, carved stones rolled over wet clay to leave an impression, have been found as far away as Egypt and Central Asia. Styles of jewelry, pottery, and writing spread along with goods. Babylon also imported stories. Myths, gods, and rituals often traveled along trade routes. The goddess Ishtar was known beyond Mesopotamia. Her symbols, stars, lions, doves, appeared in distant temples. Traders brought not only spices but gossip, rumors, and news. One humorous letter from a traveling trader reads, "In Elam, the beer is sour and the women frown. I long for Babylon." Trade could be dangerous, but it was also thrilling. The promise of profit, new sights, and a different kind of freedom lured many into its orbit, and the city thrived because of it. Market stalls in Babylon sold more than local produce. You could buy lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, incense from Arabia, wine from the Levant, ostrich eggs from the desert tribes. For the wealthy, a trip to the market was like visiting a museum of distant lands. But even ordinary folk benefited. Prices of grain and oil shifted with caravan arrivals. Foreign musicians played in taverns. Foreign words slipped into common speech. A Babylonian child might wear a shell bracelet carved in a language her parents couldn't read. All of this was recorded, quietly, faithfully, by the scribes. They noted weights, taxes, dates, and debts. One famous legal document outlines a partnership between two merchants, each investing silver, agreeing to split profits after a 3-month caravan trip. The tablet ends. Let Marduk witness this agreement. May fortune travel with them. And so it did. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture that caravan again. The sun low. The camels slow but steady. A merchant hums a tune. A scribe hands over a tablet with a nod. The road stretches ahead, lined with tamarisk trees and distant hills. Trade is risky, but Babylon always waits. We've followed the merchants on their dusty roads, the scribes in their tablet houses, the priests at their rituals. But what about the people who made all this possible behind the scenes? The ones who built the houses, hauled the bricks, ground the grain, and stitched the clothes? Let's take a slow walk into the quieter corners of the city, into the courtyards and kitchens of ordinary Babylonian homes. Most Babylonians lived in mud brick houses. Simple, sturdy, and surprisingly cool. These homes typically had a small central courtyard open to the sky, surrounded by rooms used for sleeping, cooking, and storage. Roofs were flat and often used for sleeping during the hot season. In the morning, life in these homes began early. The first sounds were the grinding stones as women crushed barley or emmer wheat into flour. This work was slow, rhythmic, and physically demanding. The smell of rising dough, smoke from small fires, and the warm scent of baked bread filled the alleyways. Children chased each other in the dust while older siblings helped with chores, fetching water from wells or canals, gathering kindling, or watching younger ones. Laundry was done at the river's edge, voices calling out over the sound of slapping fabric. Daily life was deeply practical, but not joyless. People told stories as they worked, gossiped at market stalls, sang songs to their children. In some neighborhoods, musicians would walk the streets playing lyres or pipes for small coins. Clay figurines found in homes suggest that art and play were part of life even for the poor. Most families raised a few animals, goats, chickens, maybe a donkey. These animals weren't just useful, they were also woven into daily routines and family life. A bleating goat might mean milk for breakfast. A cranky hen might escape and cause a small chase down the alley. There were no barns, just shared space. Craftspeople worked from home as well. Weaving was common with looms set up in courtyards. Spindles, whorls, and scraps of thread have been found in many household digs. Pottery, too, was often a domestic industry. Handmade bowls dried in the sun before being sold or traded. Food was simple but hearty. Beyond bread and beer, meals often included lentils, onions, dates, and herbs. Meat was rare, but occasionally a family might celebrate with a small roast. Clay tablets contain dozens of recipes, some so detailed that modern chefs have tried to recreate them. One Babylonian stew recipe includes: take water, add fat, salt, shallots, and leeks. Boil until fragrant. Add meat. Add mashed turnips and blood. Stir well. It may not be to modern taste, but it's a clear reminder that even thousands of years ago people took pride in their cooking. And of course, there were festivals. Even the humblest families participated in religious holidays. They would decorate their doors with ribbons, wear clean clothes, and prepare special dishes. Offerings were made at small home altars, often just a niche in the wall with a tiny clay figure. Families would sing together, pour out a little beer, and whisper prayers. These were moments of shared joy and meaning, a way to feel connected to the gods, the city, and each other. And what of love? What of family? Clay tablets preserve tender letters between husbands and wives, sometimes even simple romantic poems. One reads, "Like sweet oil, your love is poured over me. Like fine wool, it warms me." Marriage was both a personal and practical matter. Contracts recorded dowries, household items, and shared property. Divorce, too, was possible, and even recorded without shame. One document reads, "She shall keep the spinning tools. He shall keep the donkey. There is peace." Children were treasured. Amulets and lullabies protected them. Teachers, when scolding young scribes, often reminded them, "Your mother bore you with pain. Do not shame her." The elderly, too, were respected. Grandparents often lived in the same household, helping raise children, passing on stories, watching the rhythms of life from a low bench in the shade. And in the evening, when the sun slipped behind the rooftops, families gathered once more. They told stories of gods, heroes, foolish animals. They sang, they laughed, they prayed. The city grew quiet again. Oil lamps flickered. Clay ovens cooled. Children yawned and curled up beside their mothers. Fathers closed shutters. Goats settled. The stars rose. So much of life was unwritten, but lived fully. And the few tablets that captured these ordinary moments shine brighter than royal decrees or temple inventories, because they remind us that Babylon was not just a place of stone and kings. It was a place of hands kneading dough, of a father patting his son's head, of laughter over stew, of whispered prayers before sleep, of life, messy, loving, and beautifully human. As we reach the final stretch of our slow journey through ancient Babylon, let's shift our gaze upward, to the heavens. Because to the Babylonians the sky was not just a backdrop. It was a living map of divine intention, a text to be read, recorded, and interpreted night after night. The earliest astronomers we know of weren't Greek or Roman. They were Babylonian priests, quietly watching the stars from the rooftops of ziggurats. These watchers of the sky kept meticulous records, century after century, on thousands of clay tablets. They observed the moon's phases, the movement of planets, the timing of eclipses, and the rising and setting of constellations. They gave names to the stars, the scorpion, the bull of heaven, the true shepherd of Anu. The city was aligned with the cosmos. Temples faced cardinal directions. Rituals followed lunar cycles. Time itself was a sacred measurement, linked to celestial rhythms. And so each evening, after the markets closed and the fires dimmed, a priest might ascend the temple tower with a stylus in hand, a soft clay tablet in the other. He'd stand under the open sky and wait, calm, quiet, observing. Tonight, the planet Nergal was seen low in the west. The moon is dark. Rain will come. Jupiter and Venus are in conjunction, favorable for the king. These weren't vague guesses. Babylonian astronomers could predict eclipses with impressive accuracy. They discovered cycles of planetary motion and even understood retrograde movement. Some historians call this the earliest known example of mathematical astronomy. And yet, it was all wrapped in ritual and reverence. The stars weren't just objects. They were God's footprints, divine messages encoded in light. Imagine lying on your rooftop, the clay still warm from the day's sun, a soft breeze passing. The sky overhead is brilliant with stars, uncut diamonds set in velvet. You watch as Ishtar, Venus, rises before dawn, bright and bold. You feel awe, you feel tiny, and yet connected. Even common citizens followed the sky in simpler ways. They planted crops by the moon, marked birthdays by star risings, and told stories about constellations, heroes, animals, monsters frozen in the sky. The famous Mulopin tablets, essentially Babylon's sky almanac, listed dozens of stars and their associated omens. For example, if the Pleiades rise early, the harvest will be abundant. If Mars is red and flickering, a storm will strike. If a halo surrounds the moon, beware, disease may come. Today, we might smile at the mix of astronomy and astrology, but to Babylonian minds, there was no contradiction. Science and spirit walked hand in hand, and in a way, their work echoes forward. Much of Western astronomy owes its roots to Babylonian data, passed through Greek scholars, translated, adapted, and preserved. Even our 60-minute hour and 360-degree circle come from Babylon's base 60 counting system. So tonight, as your own sky darkens, consider those ancient stargazers. A priest wraps himself in a simple robe. He climbs the dusty steps of a ziggurat. Above him, Saturn, faint and golden. The moon, a thin curve. The stars, unmoving yet alive. He presses one more line into clay. He breathes. And somewhere, millennia later, someone finds that tablet, turns it over in their hand, and reads the same line beneath the same sky.